The sand beneath Riven Hale's fingers felt like ground glass. Every grain bit into torn skin. His breaths were ragged, a rasping bellows that puffed red mist into heat that had gone past unbearable into indifferent. The desert ran to all horizons, bronze dunes and glassy crusts, broken here and there by teeth of black stone and the half-buried ribs of something that had once been a road. Behind him, smoke yawned upward in crooked columns. The funeral pyres of his unit. The grave of his life. He crawled because crawling was simpler than giving up. Time lost its edges. His frontier shield jacket, once the color of twilight steel, hung in ribbons, salted with dust and clotted blood. Memories looped, Lieutenant Harrow's tight smile, the glint of a private comm stamped with a corporate crest, the sudden storm of blue-white fire from allies who were supposed to flank. Riven had watched good soldiers drop like cut marionettes while the desert drank their heat. The ruins gave shade. They jutted from the sand like the bones of a giant, angles wrong in ways his head didn't want to accept, arches too narrow and too tall, corners that felt like they pinched light when he looked at them. Symbols crawled the stone, lines that seemed to flex if he stared too long. He folded against a wall and slid down until his body decided enough. His canteen had gone dry 12 hours ago. His beacon had died in a wash of static when the shooting started. No one was coming. Footsteps in sand. At first they were only a suggestion, a soft rearranging. Then they came sure and deliberate, as if the desert had grown tired of quiet. Riven tried for his sidearm and found only the slick patch where its holster had torn away. Vision tunneled. Heat waves braided into a silhouette that walked out of the glare with the unbothered grace of a hunting cat. She stood a head and a half taller than any human he'd ever met, all smooth power under a pelt of burnished orange that shifted like living fire where the sun struck it. Her ears were vulpine and expressive, flicking toward the wind. A dark mask marked her muzzle and cheekbones, and along her collarbones and down both arms, intricate trails of bioluminescent filigree pulsed faintly, ink that carried its own soft light. Armor clung to her like the memory of something once whole, slim plates cracked by impacts, straps half-cut, a left pauldron spider-webbed. A chain circled one wrist, its break charred, the links still warm when they moved. Her eyes were amber, old, thoughtful, carrying a patience that made Riven think of storms that took an entire season to decide whether to break. "You," she said, and her voice was wind across a chime, a music that caught the edges of his name without having heard it. "You dragged me from fire once." Riven's throat worked. What came out was a scrape that might have been a word. Her nostrils flared, tasting the air. Cinnamon and ozone followed her in a scent that made heat smell like rain. "You won't remember," she murmured, kneeling. Her palm was cool on his cheek, her soft pads firm. "You were small and broken and filled with defiance. They were taking me then. You cursed them with a human soldier's limited words and still found hands for my chains." A tail slid behind her, long and full, the white-tipped brush swaying with its own attention. At its base, where the fur broke around a hardened cluster, an organ pulsed, pearlescent and severe, suffused with pale light. She leaned close until her shadow swallowed his world and the red sun cooled. "You are dying, Riven of the Shield," she said, speaking his name like it had been waiting in her mouth. "The desert has started its work. Your heat smells wrong. Your pulse has begun to skip towards silence." She studied him, assessing more than pitying. "I am Vera Emberwind of the Monstrous. Last of that line. My people are gone. Their songs travel now without throats." The light at her tail's thorn brightened, turning the air to glass. "I can keep one song," Vera said. "I can thread it through another. You will live, never alone again." "What does that mean?" Riven managed. "It means you will still be you," she said simply. "And you will also be me." Second sum. Two memory rivers in one body. Two hunts sharing a spine. Her ears canted, almost apologetic. "There is a cost." He thought of the smoke behind him, the brief flickers that had been voices he knew, the tidy calculus of men who had traded an ambush for credits. He thought of dying as Rivenhale and that being the end of every joke he'd never tell again. He nodded. Vera's breath flooded the hair at his temple. Then open, she said, and pressed the luminous thorn to the hollow of his throat. Light detonated. Cold burned. Heat froze. His skull filled with static and stars, and a woman's scream that was not human and had no need to be. Cities hung from purple thermals and broke like glass. Chains sang. Needles wrote in nerve. A sky of silver birds folded into flame. Riven felt a mind touch his and recoil, and then lunge with desperate care, as if afraid the door would close. He dissolved. He returned to himself the way a tide remembers shore, first in scattered foam, then in a sudden weight of water. Two sets of memories hit and scraped. His back bowed off the sand. He tasted copper and something sweet and unfamiliar, like fruit from a tree that only grew in thunderheads. Out! He groaned, hands clawing his scalp. Get out of me! A laugh answered from nowhere and everywhere, warm and tired. If only it were that simple, little soldier. His hands moved without his leave. They traced sigils into grit that his vision made briefly glow. A spiral like a sun, a slanted cross like a path through windbreakers, a series of dots that meant journey and return in a language he had not known one breath ago. When he pushed himself up, the motion was fluid, less a shove, more a decision to stand that his body understood as permission. He spoke, trying the shape of his name, and paused. His voice had acquired a second color, a harmonic that hummed under the words, not echo, not chorus, but companion. Riven, he said. The desert kept it. It sounded like more. A shard of polished alloy leaned against the ruin. He crawled to it, and dragged his face into view. For a heartbeat he saw a stranger, angular, high-cheeked, furred. Vera's morning gaze looked back, sorrow threaded with resolve. He blinked and saw himself again, but revised. The same stubborn jaw. The nose his mother had said came from a grandfather no one liked and everyone remembered. But his irises, those had gone to fire. Amber with jet motes, flecked with glints that moved on their own, like a constellation beneath a lake. At his neck, just above his collarbone, the skin glowed faintly where the thorn had kissed him. A sigil had burned in, 3 narrow arcs nested inside a circle, crossed by a line like a horizon. If he didn't look, he knew it meant Monstrous, unbroken, carried. Breathe, Vera said from inside him, and the command was a thumb press to panic. Name the things you can name. The world will fit better around them. Sky, he said. Ruins. Smoke. Thirst. It helped. He found his feet and discovered the bruises of an hour ago had gone to memory. He didn't feel unhurt, he felt reissued. Strength thrummed subtle in his limbs, a humming undersense that told him the wind would shift in 20 heartbeats, and that somewhere far away, a dune was falling. Distant lights braided the horizon, edging closer, 3, maybe 4 vehicles, running dark except for instruments a human eye wouldn't notice. For a snap he thought rescue, but alongside it came a second reflex. Cover, flanking arcs, calm discipline. No, listen. The caution wasn't his. It came from someone who had been betrayed more times than there were stars visible noonday, and still refused to stop calling the sky home. He descended the ruin at a measured pace and walked out to meet the lights. The column stopped 100 paces out. Armor plates carried dust like a second skin. Sensors hummed. Guns remained at low ready. A sergeant dismounted, a compact woman with a scar that pulled the corner of her mouth, expression born from too many necessary orders. On your knees, she said. Hands laced behind your head. Identify. Rivenhale, he answered, complying. Frontier Shield Ranger. 894. Lost contact after the Talon Ridge action. The words fell out correct and wrong. They fit like a borrowed coat. A private with a handheld scanner tramped over, held the unit up, frowned when it pinged, frowned harder when it didn't. It's him, the private said, confused. And it isn't. Ma'am, I'm getting 2. That's not how 2 works. The sergeant stepped closer, light finding the mark at Riven's throat. The sigil answered, brightening with the attention like an eye narrowing. Weapons ticked from ready to aimed. Parasite? The private breathed. Or command hardware, the sergeant said flat. Something that makes a voice in your head not your own. Containment protocols. Flex cuffs. Hood. She keyed the squad net. Patrol 6. Package possibly compromised. Bringing him in. They will cut you and call it learning, Vera said. No fear in it. Only the weight of witness rooms. Riven let them cuff him. He knelt, hands behind. When the hood came out, when its black edges eclipsed the world, something inside him that was not him snapped like wire under too much winter. The cuffs shattered with a sound like shot glass in cold water. Vera didn't take his body, she lent it perfect timing. Riven flowed. 3 steps, 3 taps. Elbows, throat, temple. A rifle skittered. He caught a second soldier by the harness and turned, letting their momentum spend itself into the sand. The sergeant brought her sidearm up. Riven's palm kissed the slide and guided it skyward. The shot went wide into a ruin's face. He dipped under a baton, tapped a nerve cluster at the elbow, and the arm went sleep-heavy. In 12 heartbeats, the patrol lay winded and bound with their own restraints, breathing and cursing. The sergeant sat back hard, eyes huge. "What are you?" she whispered. Riven tasted answers and found none that wouldn't get him on a table. He stood and put distance between them and himself. "Don't follow," he said softly. The harmonic under his voice made the command feel like the kind of suggestion you regret ignoring. Then he turned and walked into the dark, the desert receiving him as if it had been expecting 2 sets of footsteps all along. Night stretched like a bruise. Riven didn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he stood on spires of stone that floated on thermals like slow birds and knew what every rope and rail would feel like under his hands. He tasted fruit he had never seen, tart-sweet with a bite that made his jaw ache. His fingers broke a ration bar into 7 pieces, and he arranged them in a star before he realized what he was doing. He cursed, hurled the food into the dark, then stooped and picked it up again. Waste is a habit learned fast. Unlearning takes longer. By noon the next day, he smelled something wrong. Metal and ion and a taut note under it that felt like fear rubbed on leather. He crested a rise and saw angles where there shouldn't be angles. A camp lay crouched against a clutch of rock towers. Its structures bent light wrong. Planes that seemed to curve if he didn't look at them directly, shadows that arrived a heartbeat after the object casting them. The inhabitants moved like predators used to getting first choice. Tall. Jointed, not joint right. Armor that looked grown rather than forged. Riven's lip curled, exposing teeth in a way no human taught him. The feeling that rose in him wasn't rage. Rage is hot. This was colder. An old verdict. Numbers and names and songs stripped down to samples and filed. "Don't," Vera said. Gentle, like you'd murmur to a child reaching toward a coal stove. "Not because I forbid you. Because we could do more than spend pain like coin tossed at a soldier's funeral." "Show me how," he said. He watched the rest of the day, counted sentries, learned tracks in sand the way a tracker learns breath, felt the hum of fields that didn't want to be crossed and learned the patches where they went thin. Human tech thinks in lines and beams. There's thought in lattices and tuned hollows. Vera taught him to step where the songs sagged. He went at sundown. He didn't prowl so much as occupy spaces between glances. A sentry's neck came apart under precise hands. Another turned at the wrong moment, and Riven's strike unstitched something vital inside a chest that had parts he didn't want to name. Alarms spun. He moved. Bodies fell. He made choices the way a surgeon makes cuts, quick, clean, purposeful. When it ended, fluorescence spilled from wounds and pooled in sand. Then the purpose continued. He swept. He took what could be taken, tools that listened to no species, a knife that sang when it bit air, lenses that let him taste heat. The rest he burned. Before flame, he found records, nodes compressed into jewel-bright polyhedrons. He pressed one to the mark at his throat, and it softened like wax and bled images into his mind. Not conquest. Catalog. Not flags. Lists. Planet after planet reduced to an index. Data. Genetic sequences. Artifacts. Harvests. Riven set the tent with their mission tags alight and watched it feed on its own story. They will think this lost noise, Vera said, eyelids heavy behind his eyes. We will teach them harmony. When? He asked. When we gather a choir. He walked 3 days and 2 nights, and on the 3rd night the dunes unfolded to reveal a city that hadn't been there a blink before. He didn't know how he'd missed it. He understood at once how others would. Structures grew rather than stood, spirals and shells, white bone and bronze skin, studded with small living lights. The air tasted different, minerals and water and a music so low his bones answered. They were already around him when he realized he was surrounded. 24, some vulpine like Vera, dyed in colder palettes, some sleek and eel-limbed, some heavy with plated backs, one that felt like a tree given legs and patience. All carried weapons that had more in common with tools than guns. All watched with eyes that were old in different ways. You carry the scent of ember and sky, said one, stepping forward. Vulpine. Tall. Her fur like winter sunlight over snow, pale at the roots, fire at the tips. Her markings burned brighter than the others, braided into patterns that even Vera within him breathed at. But your bones are human. What are you, wanderer? Riven opened his mouth. What came out wasn't a human language. The vowels tasted like wind against teeth. I am second son, he said in Monstrous cant. I carry Vera Emberwind. She carries me. Weapons dipped. Heads bowed. A breath huffed through the crowd like a ripple in tall grass. Impossible, the leader whispered, and it wasn't denial, merely wonder that hadn't caught up to duty. We marked her passing on the high air. She passed, Riven said. She also chose. I am the choosing. Show us, the leader said. He didn't reach for song. It climbed his spine like a cat and issued from his mouth before shame or fear could make it small. The melody felt like tracing scars. Notes that had once wound over festivals and underhunts came out cut and spliced, new because the throat was new, old because the breath had been saved from a fire. Markings along his neck shone so bright the chamber lights bent to make room. Memories blurred. For a beat he didn't remember his own mother's face, and terror tried to chew him hollow. The crowd knelt. He couldn't. He didn't know if standing meant reverence or refusal. He did it anyway. A name, the leader said hoarsely, standing again. I am Sava of the Durift. We welcome the second son. They showed him their refuge. It sloped downward in tunnels carved by water and patient hands. Gardens glowed with bioluminescent vines wrapped around fruit like lanterns, citrus that bled blue, nuts that tapped faint rhythms as if calling to be cracked in proper time. He was given a chamber that had been grown to fit 2 lives. Furniture should have fit the vulpine most, but when he sat, his back sighed. The bed smelled faintly of something he could only call home and didn't question. Over the next hours, leaders came. They brought food and questions and stories that tasted like exile. They weren't all Monstrous. Refugees wore borrowed shapes and shared grief, a canyon-eyed miner whose people had been turned into solvent for someone else's engines, a singer with translucent skin who still hummed harmony lines under breath even when speaking, a scholar with mandibles that clicked when she laughed. We've been waiting, Sava said finally. She didn't make it sound like prophecy so much as logistics. The old words spoke of a bridge. We hoped it meant time. It appears it meant a throat. What do you expect me to be? Riven asked. Coordinator, said a lanky eel-limbed veteran who had the scars of a dozen quiet wars. Translator. Knife. He tipped his chin toward Riven's mark. We know how humans fight. We know how we fight. The invaders know both. They do not know a chorus. Riven almost laughed, and didn't. I am one person. You are one more person than we had yesterday, Sava said. And one mind that remembers 2 ways to hunt. That is mathematics in our favor. He slept like falling. When he woke, his senses had been tuned a notch tighter. He could name the weight of water in the far cistern by the sound it made against sandstone. He could feel the tide of heat moving through the tunnels ahead of a breeze. Stronger, yes, but also stranger. The human in him winced at how fast the line moved. They didn't waste time. Salva brought maps, their maps, alive, woven of light and thread that shifted as you teased edges, merged with human satellite captures stolen while no one watched. Riven laid captured polyhedrons on the table. They unfurled like flowers and spilled the invaders' routes in elegant contempt. It isn't conquest, he said, tasting iron. It's procedure. They strip what can be carried and weld what can't into monuments to the idea they were here. The scholar clicked. They call it archive. Harvest, Salva said, and the word landed like ash. And here? She gestured at a cluster of icons converging near a human city on the trade spurs. Riven's stomach went cold. He rotated the display. Warnings snapped together. Not harvest. Sterilization. When resistance costs more than cargo, they salt the field. How long? Salva asked. He listened to rhythms he couldn't have named last week and found an answer that made his tongue dry. 2 sunrises. Silence. Then movement. Orders braided and unbraided, runners dispatched into tunnels, caches opened, oaths spoken under breath. Riven felt Vera watch with him, a bone-deep approving hum. Not all eyes approved. A scarred Monstrous veteran, draken by the rings woven into his ear, stepped out of the flow and planted himself in Riven's path. The weapon in his hand was built to crack hulls and temper tempers. His markings told stories in jagged lines, a dozen hunts, none gone clean. You were a canter's death on a human throat, he said, ears flat. What gives you the right to call war under her name? Riven didn't reach for power. Power reached for him. It liked conflicts like this. They trained the hand. Color gathered along his mark until the skin at his throat felt sunburned from the inside. You think I stole her? Riven said. No anger. No apology. Just the shape of a thing that didn't need to be argued, only stated correctly. I didn't. She asked. You can honor her choices or go on believing the only one good enough to where her voice died with her lungs. Draken lifted the weapon. Salva's hand flexed toward her sidearm and then stilled. A child peered around a pillar, small, ears too big still for her head, curious as breeches. Riven saw the choice break 2 ways and took the third. He raised his palm and sang one note. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. The air stiffened like glass. Draken's weapon coughed particles and nothing emerged. The feedback kicked the housing hot. He dropped it with a hiss and stared. Careful with our walls, second son. Salva murmured. They held, Riven replied, throat raw from a single syllable. Are you her? The child asked, stepping forward before anyone could stop her. She had flecks of gold paint in the fur at her wrists, a mark of some rite he didn't know. My grandmother says Vera could spin storm songs so fine the rain would braid itself between rocks. Will you do that? For the gardens? Riven folded to a knee so their eyes matched. For an instant his vision doubled, the foxfire glare of Vera's gaze overlaid with his own tired brown that used to be brown. I'm not her, he said. I'm the way she kept going. If you show me where the gardens complain, I will sing and see. The child, Little Ember, someone called her, and the name stuck to Riven's bones, smiled like breaking dawn. Draken's ears flicked upright, not surrender, not apology, but the first step toward both. Salva exhaled. We move tonight, she said. We sing tomorrow. The camp breathed as one, nervous, angry, trying to pretend it wasn't. Riven walked the underground orchards with Little Ember padding alongside and Salva's shadow trailing at respectful distance. He hummed the way Vera had once hummed to pipes and wheelhouses, feeling where the water snagged. He loosened chords and the flow laughed. Children watched. The ill-limbed fighter nodded once, and engineers nod to a fix that will hold. When he slept, fear obligingly visited. He dreamed his body moving with a perfection he had never owned and maybe never would. Every pivot correct, each strike turned a degree to place it where it had to go, no wasted heat. He dreamed watching himself from above and could not remember how to fit back in. The figure below looked up with amber eyes and smiled with someone else's mouth. "You're fading," the mirror said in the voice he had but didn't. "Soon there will only be the song." He woke with the taste of dust and orange pith. The chamber was quiet. His breath sounded like two lungs remembering when to agree. "You are afraid of being replaced," Vera said. Not accusing. Not soothing. Naming. "I'm afraid that when this is over, there won't be room left for me to be anything except a story you like better," he whispered. "We are both dead if we make this a contest," she said. "We are both alive if we make this a braid." He sat with that and found the truth in it. You can fight the tide or learn to read it. Only one keeps you from drowning. He rose before the others and went to the highest place the sanctuary allowed. Dawn was still thinking about it. He looked up and named stars Vera had known as routes and Riven had known as romance. "Okay," he told them. "Let's be new." They didn't march. Marching is for being seen. They flowed, teams of mixed hands carrying kit that had not existed the week before, and had always existed as problems and solutions finally met. Human rifles had been sleeved with coils built from scavenged field harmonics. Monstrous blades had been tempered in chemical baths that tasted like batteries on the tongue. The eel-limbed fighters had anchored lines where air currents would do more work than muscle. At the mouth of the valley, Riven stopped. The mark at his throat burned now without light, a heat like memory. He spread his hands and the ground under his boots hummed. This ridge wasn't sacred in any way a service map would respect. But it had bones that ran deep and old. Vera had sung to places like this, and they had sung back. Ships came like falling math. Kilometers long, bending the sky where they went, broadcasting the humane calculus of genocide: surrender. Be catalogued. Resist. Be made clean. They deployed the latticed angels, the harvest arrays, that made air smell like copper when they passed. The arrays found nothing except a bait-set settlement. Their scanners called the valley empty. Riven had taught the ground to be quiet about the important parts. He breathed in and sang. It wasn't pretty. Pretty is for after. What he did reached for the frequency where things remember what holds them together. It found the gaps in the invaders' harmonics and asked them to widen. It found the seams in their shieldwork and suggested, politely but firmly, that seam and tear had a lot in common. The first ship to line a shot over his head fired a weapon that would have made a crater like a new religion. The beam broke into dust and went home as heat. Teams moved on cues the song delivered, hitches in rhythm, pauses where a bar should be. They blew charges under shield spines. They fed cheater rounds into breech mouths. They did work. Good work. The kind you tell truth about later even if other truth is easier to sell. The fleet tried to pivot. Their math didn't have a variable for what Riven was. They keyed weapons to a spectrum because spectrum is how you aim. Riven played outside spectrum and the weapons coughed and apologized and ate their own power curves. In the corner of his eye, Salva moved like someone who had trained her whole life to improvise perfectly. Drekken's howl turned from challenge to joy without ever bothering to pass by apology. Little Ember stood with other children in a shelter and sang the counter-melody taught to the youngest, because sometimes fear moves easier if it's busy. 3 hours. The sky filled with wreck. The ships didn't so much explode as forget how to be ships. Things that should have been permanent became options. Fire climbed ladders and came down again like it hadn't made up its mind. The desert stood patient and took what fell. When it was done, Riven's voice wasn't. It broke on a last note and left his body. He fell to his knees in sand that had been glassed and then talked out of it. Hands caught him, human and not, and he heard Salva say something that sounded like a prayer breathing like a curse. Cost, Vera said from far and near. I told you. Worth it? He asked, mouth too numb for words to sit incorrectly. Ask the ones who got to keep names, she said. He woke under canvas that had been grown for him as if the earth had dreamt fabric. The mark at his throat had gone from blaze to ember. Medics, one human was asleep in her eyes, One mandible-clicking scholar with hands like precise questions argued about fluids. He sat up and watched them frown at the same time, and knew diplomacy had begun. Outside, the valley sounded wrong and right. Wrong was salvage crews prying at ship ribs. Right with laughter coated in shock. He stood and the room tried to tilt, his body corrected. The world came back in layers. "What do we call you?" asked a human commander at the tent flap when he emerged. She wore 3 ranks and more worry. Gratitude had creased her face in ways command never would let fully show. Fear had set up a small camp beside it and pitched a companionable lean-to. He considered the easy answer and discarded it. He considered the accurate one and made it a story. "I am Riven," he said. "And I am Emberwind. Second son. Bridgeborn." He put his palm against the burning sigil and felt 2 pulses under it. The human thud he knew from counting heartbeats during long watches, and a second, quicker, dancing rhythm that made him want to run along ridgelines and pull clouds down by hand. "If your mouth needs one word, it can use ardent." "Ardent," she repeated, and the word tasted less like a person and more like a job. Maybe that was right. Jobs kept people from becoming statues. Word went out. Not on channels, too many ears, but in food and song and gear that arrived that shouldn't have and made sense anyway. Somewhere in the wreck below, an invader ship's mind still lived, confused and messy. The eel-limbed fighters argued about who got to extract it. The children practiced their counter-melodies and got bored and ran into the gardens, which meant they had futures again. In the night, Riven stood on sand cooled to tolerable, and watched stars that mapped differently for each of his halves. "Who are we now?" he asked without lips. "Hungry," Vera answered, amused and aching. "Tired. Dangerous. Alive." He smiled and let the desert wind comb sweat from his hair and the ruff of fur that had begun to come in along the line of his jaw. He did not look behind him, where 2 shadows overlapped just enough to keep each other honest. Victory is a taste. It sweetens first, and then reveals the grit between teeth. The day after, wreckage became taxes nobody had asked to pay. Human command wanted reports. The refuge wanted autonomy that wasn't a polite way of saying goodbye. Scavengers arrived with smiles wide enough to be mistaken for knives. Riven, ardent when papers wanted him, spent hours doing a new kind of fighting. He stood between old habits and new math. He taught officers how to listen when a fox-eared elder said the sand was nervous, and meant the ground would liquefy if they parked a tank there. He taught hunters how to recognize a human supply unit that would share if you asked and shoot if you didn't. He failed often and learned faster than the failures could weight him to the earth. The invaders did not stay quiet. Their loss here snapped something brittle in their doctrine. Patrols changed patterns. Harvests shortened to hits. Someone had whispered in their lattice minds that deserts could sing and a throat could stand in the way of procedure. They began to ask new questions with old weapons. Refugees flowed in like flood after icebreak. A woman with eyes made of prisms and hands burned to the wrist by whatever she'd stood between and ruin. A trio of brothers who shared one shadow between the 3 and didn't talk about what happened to the 4th. A human boy with a good impersonation of someone who had not seen anything worse than a bar brawl. The settlement made room by teaching rooms to be bigger. Draken found Riven on a ridge. The wind pulled theirs back and made the air feel cleaner than conversation. Draken held his weapon like a habit and not like a threat. "I loved her," he said without looking. "Once." Riven didn't answer. There are moments that improve by not being shared out loud. "She chose you," Draken continued. "Not me. Not any of us who built our bodies around her songs." He rolled his shoulder like a man trying to relocate a hurt that wouldn't go. "If you compile that into a victory, I will take your throat. If you make it a duty, I will stand at your back." Riven let the wind fill the pause. "It feels like being picked up by a river that will not set you down," he said. "I wouldn't call that a victory." Draken's ears tilted forward the half-degree that means approval in Monstrous. "Duty it is." They built a network out of stubbornness and grief and a little joy. Human cells that had been fighting alone learned to pass packages wrapped in solution song. Monstrous scouts set beacons in canyons that only eels could reach. The scholars taught a half-dozen species how to extract data from polyhedrons without letting them bite. Children played under wrecked hulls that had been told to behave. Someone brewed a drink that made your teeth numb and your courage stupid for exactly 1 hour, and then responsibly regretted itself. Riven trained. He learned how to turn his borrowed strength into something that didn't break what it held. He learned how to sing while moving and move while singing. He learned how to fail with a good face and a plan for not doing it twice. Vera pushed when he slacked and rested him when he didn't know he needed it. They fought. They forgave. They braided. News came. The archive, call them what they liked, had begun to treat the planet like a problem that needed crushing rather than solving. 2 fleets burned for tundra cities where stone kept secrets. A third veered toward a coastline where the last pure water tables sulked under salt. We can't be everywhere, Sava said, not sore about it, only precise. No, Riven agreed. But we can be where the math expects us least. He pointed to a map no one else would have selected first. A canyon full of wind and teeth, miles from any resource a sane invader would trade casualties to hold. He smiled, and the smile looked too much like Vera's and not enough like his, and he let that be true. Let's teach them what a detour costs. The canyon was a scar 10 miles long, carved where a river had once fought a war with stone and eventually bled itself out. Wind owned it now. The gust came screaming down its throat in bursts that could knock a human flat if they weren't ready. To Vera's senses, it was a choir. Each shift of current a note, each eddy a counterpoint. To Riven, it was opportunity. They'll skin it as geological noise, he explained to Sava and the other commanders as they huddled around a 3D sand table. Too many anomalies, too much interference for their sensors to want to chew through. If we bait them in, we can force their ships into positions they'd never choose. Draken spat into the dust, a sign of wary respect. Or we get ourselves crushed like bugs against canyon walls. Only if we mistime the currents. Vera's voice hummed through Riven's throat. His ears twitched with her instincts, a motion he still wasn't used to. But we won't mistime them. The plan was simple in outline, and possible in detail. Resistance fighters would lure a detachment of the Archive's harvest ships into the canyon with decoy signals. Once inside, the invaders' advantage, open skies and scanning supremacy, would be stripped away. Ambush teams hidden in wind-carved hollows would strike from above and below, using weapons tuned to the specific weaknesses Riven and Vera had pulled from the captured polyhedrons. Timing is everything, Riven warned. If we release charges a breath too soon, the currents scatter the blast. Too late, and the ships grind us into canyon walls. Every strike has to land on the rhythm. We have to sing this battle. Little Ember tugged at his sleeve as the meeting broke. Will you be the one who keeps the song? She asked, Ember eyes wide. Riven knelt so she wouldn't have to crane her neck. Yes, little star, he said softly. I'll keep it. Even if the canyon itself has to learn new notes. Dawn crawled pink over the desert as the resistance took positions. The canyon's entrance, called the Maw by scouts, yawned like the open jaws of some fossil beast. Riven lay belly down on a ledge high above, body painted with dust, his rifle resting beside him. Below, Yeoland scouts clung to sheer walls as naturally as ivy, weapons maglocked to their spines. Draken crouched in the shadows of a lower shelf, his heavy weapon braced, amber eyes fixed. The decoy transmitters began their song, faux distress signals carrying frequencies that tugged at archive sensors like blood in water. Riven felt the canyon itself grow still in anticipation, the winds easing for one long, silent beat. Then came the ships. 3 harvest cruisers, long as city blocks, drifted down toward the Maw. Their hulls bent light, their weapons hummed with energies that could reduce stone to powder. They descended cautiously at first, then with growing confidence when no resistance fire greeted them. Exactly as planned? Riven's throat burned with the urge to begin. He swallowed and waited, muscles taut. Patience was the hardest part. The lead cruiser crossed the marker stone below, the point of no return. Riven inhaled. His voice, no, their voice, rose in a low, thrumming chord. It wasn't words but rhythm, a cadence woven into every fighter's bones over the last days of drilling. The canyon answered. Charges detonated in perfect sequence, not explosions but directed bursts of compressed air and sound, timed to the shifting winds. The blast slammed into the cruiser's shields at precisely the right vector, bending its descent into a spiral that scraped hull against rock. Sparks and luminous fluids sprayed like fireworks. "No!" Riven sang. The ambush erupted. Ill-limbed fighters dropped from above, planting charges along shield seams. Drekken's heavy weapon roared, spitting a beam that gnawed through alien plating. Human rifles laced the air with smart rounds, each one finding weak points like they had been whispered to by ghosts. The canyon became a crucible. Ships roared. Wind screamed. And in the middle of it all, Riven stood with his arms raised, markings flaring, keeping rhythm so every fighter knew when to strike, when to fall back, when to breathe. The first cruiser went down hard, collapsing against the canyon wall in a blooming of flame and fractured stone. The second fought like a cornered predator, blasting ledges apart, and incinerating half a squad before its engines choked on redirected currents. The third almost broke them. It pushed deeper into the canyon than expected, adapting faster than Riven thought possible. Its shields harmonized against their blasts, its weapons pulsed to counter their cadence. For a moment, panic fluttered at the edges of the resistance line. Fighters faltered. Riven's vision blurred. Vera surged forward within him, her instincts flooding his limbs. He leapt from the ledge, rolling as the ship's energy beam vaporized the stone he just occupied. He landed in dust and fire, his body moving with borrowed grace. "You can't outfight it," Vera's voice whispered through him. "You must outsing it." He stood in the open, chest heaving, and let the canyon take his voice. The note he gave wasn't human, it split in harmonics, 3 pitches at once, resonating against the cruiser's shield. The canyon walls caught the sound and threw it back, building a feedback loop that grew until the air itself trembled. The cruiser's shield cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. Draken roared and fired. The eel-limbed fighters swarmed. The third ship fell, tumbling like a broken god into the canyon floor. Silence followed. Silence, and the stench of burning metal. Riven staggered, knees buckling. His throat bled from the strain, copper on his tongue. Vera steadied him from within, but her voice was faint, strained. "We asked too much," she murmured. "But it was worth it." He looked around at the fighters emerging from smoke and rubble. Some wept. Some laughed. Too many lay still. The canyon had its toll. Little Ember ran to him, dust-streaked face alight with both terror and awe. "You kept the song," she said breathlessly. Riven sank to one knee, pulling her close. "No," he rasped. "We kept it." The survivors pulled the wounded out of the canyon's shattered belly. Smoke rose in slow, greasy columns, staining the morning sky. The harvest ship's wreck still hummed, leaking dying pulses of alien energy into the dust. Their corpses would poison the earth for weeks. Riven sat against a stone, throat raw, every breath a rasp that tasted like blood and burnt copper. Vera's presence was muted, like someone far away in the same room, still there, but exhausted. "We asked more than we should have," she whispered. "I bent the river too hard. I'll mend, but slower now." He closed his eyes. Memories bled together. His own, faces of comrades from Talon Ridge, laughter over rations, the sudden shock of betrayal, and hers, Vera's, wings of light spanning a purple sky, her mother's voice weaving star songs, the fire that had consumed her people. He was never sure where the line ended anymore. Draken approached, limping, one arm slung in a makeshift sling. His ears tilted forward, respectful for the first time. "You stood in the canyon's throat and sang death into their bones," he said gruffly. "I was wrong to doubt." "You weren't wrong," Riven croaked. "You were careful." He tried for a smile, but it cracked his lips. "Careful keeps people alive." Draken grunted and lowered himself to sit beside him. Then be careful, Ardent. You're no use to us if you burn yourself hollow every battle. Around them, scavengers picked through wrecks. Human engineers pried alien alloys free. Monstrous scouts harvested what could be salvaged without poisoning themselves. Salva moved among them, issuing calm orders, her presence like stone underfoot. Little Ember carried water skins to the wounded, her small hands steady despite the carnage. Riven forced himself to his feet, ignoring the way his legs shook. This was just 3 ships, he rasped. They'll send more. Next time we can't just hope the canyon sings with us. Salva met his eyes, amber on amber. Then teach us to sing louder. That night, the survivors gathered in a circle atop the canyon rim. Fires burned low, not for warmth but for ritual. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and loss. The dead were laid out in rows. Some wrapped in human canvas, others draped in bioluminescent cloth that shimmered faintly with the stories of their clans. Children painted marks on the foreheads of the fallen, stars, rivers, suns, symbols of journeys completed. Salva raised her hand. We sing for those who gave breath in the canyon, she said, voice steady though her ears drooped with grief. We remember them in the only way that matters, by weaving their lives into ours. The singing began soft, a thrum like distant thunder. Human voices joined alien ones, weaving discordant tones that gradually found harmony. The Monstrous clan songs twined with human funeral chants, the melodies climbing together until the desert itself seemed to hum. Riven sang too, though his throat rebelled. Vera steadied his voice, carrying notes he couldn't have reached alone. Memories not his own spilled from him in song, Vera's people dancing under aurora skies, laughter echoing across crystal cliffs, the last cries of warriors chained in sterile rooms. He sang their grief in his, until the lines blurred and tears burned hot against his cheeks. When the song ended, silence held the camp in a fragile grip. Then Little Ember stepped forward. She placed a small painted stone on the ground and whispered, "For those who will hear it tomorrow." Her voice was clear, fearless. The silence broke with murmurs of approval. Riven felt something shift in his chest. The canyon had taken much, but it had given something too. Not victory. Not hope. A beginning. 2 days later, the arguments began. The resistance had grown in numbers after the canyon victory. Refugees streamed in, drawn by stories of the Second Son, who broke harvest ships with song. Humans brought rifles and old artillery. Aliens brought weapons carved from cultures the archive had thought extinct. The sanctuary tunnels overflowed with voices. And with numbers came disagreements. Human officers demanded stronger defenses around cities, insisting survival depended on holding population centers. Alien leaders argued for mobility, striking archive convoys before they could regroup. Some whispered that relying on Riven, on Ardent, was dangerous, that no one person should carry so much power. Salva tried to mediate, but tempers frayed. In one council meeting, a human captain slammed his fist on the table. We can't build a strategy around one man and a fox spirit in his skull. What happens when he burns himself out or turns against us? Draken bristled, ears flat. He carries Vera's essence. She chose him. That makes him more than one man. Or less, the captain snapped. What if he isn't human anymore? The room erupted in arguments. Riven sat silent, his hands clenched, feeling both halves of himself pulled in opposite directions. He wanted to shout that he was still him. But was he? Vera's voice whispered within, calm and sad. They are right to fear. Power makes even allies cautious. You must decide whether to be a symbol or a soldier. You cannot be both forever. That night, Riven walked alone through the desert. The stars burned cold above. 2 shadows stretched from him, one human, one vulpine. Overlapping, never quite merging. He stared at them until dawn, and wondered which would remain when the other faded. The next attack did not come from the sky. It came at night, when the tunnels of the sanctuary pulsed faintly with their living lights and the resistance slept in clusters of uneasy exhaustion. Riven's ears, his own, reshaped subtly by Vera's influence, twitched awake before his eyes did. A wrong note in the air. A footstep too careful. He rolled to his feet silently. His hand found a blade gifted by the eel-limbed scouts, its edge singing faintly when it left its sheath. The first assassin emerged from the shadows of his chamber wall, human, armored, eyes wide with purpose. A vibroknife hissed down toward his throat. Riven twisted aside, letting instinct and alien grace braid together. His counterstrike was precise, not killing but disarming, sending the weapon spinning away. 3 more followed, each from different species. One moved with the broken-limbed speed of a predator bred for tunnels, another with human military precision, the last carrying a weapon that bent light around its edge. They were not archive soldiers. These were resistance fighters, his own supposed allies. Why? He demanded, his voice carrying the layered harmonics that made the chamber itself tremble. Because you're a danger, the human spat. You'll burn us all. Better to end you now than watch you become another archive experiment wearing our skin. The fight was brutal in its intimacy. Steel on stone, claws against fur, sparks lighting the narrow chamber. Riven held back as much as he could, refusing to kill those who should have been allies. Vera seethed inside him. They doubt the choice. Show them why it was made. In the end, he stood panting over 4 unconscious bodies, their weapons scattered, the chamber wall scarred with new cuts. Blood dripped from his arm where the light-bending blade had kissed him. The council awoke to chaos. Some demanded the would-be assassins be executed. Others argued their fear was justified. Sava silenced the chamber with a single sharp bark. Doubt is natural, but betrayal in the dark is not. She turned her amber gaze on Riven. This will keep happening until you prove beyond question who and what you are. He wanted to argue, to say he didn't need to prove anything. But deep inside, he felt the truth of it. Symbols invited both faith and knives. By Suntra's tradition, disputes of faith were settled not with words but with songs, trials in which the accused wove their soul into sound, allowing the listeners to judge truth by resonance. Sava proposed such a trial for Riven. Humans scoffed at the idea, calling it superstition. The alien refugees, however, murmured in reverence. Even Draken nodded grimly. If he truly carries Vera, the song will show it. If not, he let the words hang heavy in the chamber. The trial was set at dusk in the great cavern beneath the sanctuary. Hundreds gathered, humans, Monstrous, eelfolk, crystalline-skinned singers, even children perched on ledges high above. Torches flickered. The air held the stillness of judgment. Riven stood in the center, throat still raw from the canyon battle. Fear clawed at him. What if he failed? What if the song rang hollow, proving the doubters right? You are not alone, Vera whispered. Let me carry what you cannot. He closed his eyes and let go. The sound that poured from him was not a song in any human sense. It was memory turned to vibration. It was chains breaking, wings burning, laughter around desert fires, the grief of 2 people stitched together by survival. His markings blazed, filling the cavern with amber fire. Voices around him joined in, unbidden, pulled into the current. When it ended, silence reigned for a heartbeat. Then the cavern erupted in thunderous voices, cheers, howls, chants. Even the human officers who had scoffed stood pale, shaken, their doubt cracked. Sava raised her hand. The trial has spoken. The second song is true. But Riven felt no triumph. Only exhaustion, and the weight of knowing that with every note, he gave more of himself away to Vera's echo. The celebration did not last long. 2 nights later, a lone figure staggered into the sanctuary. Human, uniform scorched to rags, face blistered from radiation burns. He collapsed at the gates, clutching a data slate to his chest. Riven was there when the medics pried it from his hands. The soldier's voice cracked like old leather. They burned Meridian Base. The archive sterilized it. No survivors. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Meridian Base had been one of the last great strongholds, a city of 500,000. Gone, wiped from the map. The data slate flickered, displaying orbital scans. The Archive's fleet had descended in force, raining weapons that reduced matter to component particles. Where once had been walls, homes, families, now lay only glass and ash. The soldier died before dawn. His last words were a whisper. "Don't let us be forgotten." Riven sat in the silence that followed, staring at the slate until his vision blurred. Rage bubbled in his chest, mingling with Vera's old grief until he couldn't tell where his anger ended and hers began. "They are accelerating," Sava said grimly. "We can no longer wait for them to make mistakes. We must strike first." Riven nodded, voice low and hoarse. "Then we carry the war to them. To their ships. To their nests. To whatever gods they whisper to when they harvest." The plan was madness. Even Riven knew it. But desperation often birthed madness. Using fragments of archive tech salvaged from the canyon wrecks, the Resistance's engineers had cobbled together a vessel capable of piercing orbit undetected. It was a Frankenstein machine, half-human shuttle, half-alien hull, stitched with suntress harmonics that made it sing like something alive. Its mission: infiltrate the Archive fleet, plant explosives within their command vessels, and cripple their ability to sterilize entire regions. Riven volunteered immediately. Draken followed, growling that no suntress would let a human alone carry their ancestors' fire into the stars. Salva chose the eel-limbed scouts for infiltration, their bodies perfect for clinging to the alien architecture of ships. Human command added their best sharpshooters, grim men and women who had nothing left to lose. Little Ember cried when Riven told her he was leaving. "What if you don't come back?" she whispered. He knelt, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then sing for me," he said. "Sing so the Archive knows my name, even if I don't." The vessel rose at midnight, streaking toward the stars. Below, the desert glowed faintly with fires from the wrecks they had left behind. Above, the Archive fleet loomed like a constellation of predators. As the vessel shuddered through the atmosphere, Vera's voice filled him, strong again, unyielding. "This is the song I was born for. Together, we end their harvest." Riven gripped the edge of his seat, amber fire burning in his eyes. "Then let's make them remember us." The stars opened before them like a maw waiting to be filled with fire. The vessel slid into the belly of the Archive fleet like a shadow grafted to night. Its mismatched hull whispered in harmonics tuned by suntress singers, frequencies that convinced Archive sensors to treat it as background radiation. Every heartbeat felt borrowed. Every breath was a coin tossed to fate. From the view slit, Riven saw the enemy armada spread across the sky, kilometer-long harvest ships bristling with spines, escorts like angular predators circling them, drone swarms glittering like dust motes of light. It was not an army. It was a factory in orbit, designed for efficiency, not glory. Draken muttered under his breath, ears pinned flat. "Like locusts. They don't even look at what they eat. Just strip and move on." The eelfolk scout beside him clicked her tongue in agreement, eyes unblinking. "Better that they look away," she said. "Easier to cut them." The vessel latched onto the hull of a cruiser with a muted clang. Inside, silence stretched tight. Everyone checked gear one last time. Blades hummed, rifles clicked. Fear was there, sharp and real, but braided with something harder: resolve. Riven's sigil burned against his throat, warm as a second pulse. Vera's presence coiled through him, fierce and eager. "I have walked their halls before. I know the rhythm of their steps, the taste of their lights. Follow me, and we will walk unseen." He breathed once, deeply, and whispered to the team. "We move." Archive ships were not built for flesh. Their corridors twisted with alien geometry, angles that pressed on the eye like migraines. Walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, carrying fluid light through translucent veins. The air smelled of cold iron and ozone, tinged with something that reminded Riven of sterilized bone. The team crept through shadows, clinging to the unnatural architecture. The eelfolk moved like water, climbing walls and ceilings as though gravity was a polite suggestion. Human sharpshooters covered angles, fingers steady on alien triggers modified to fire projectiles instead of plasma. Draken strode with silent fury, weapon cradled but ready. Riven led, guided by Vera's memories. She whispered warnings. That door hums with energy. Their guards breathe through gills, aim there. Step wide, the floor drinks weight in that corner. He obeyed, and the team survived. At one junction, an archive drone slithered past, all spines and sensory stalks, scanning with invisible beams. Riven froze, feeling it taste the air. His sigil flared, sending a ripple through the drone's perception. It hesitated, chirped in confusion, then glided away. The team exhaled as one. Every step deeper into the ship twisted the knot in Riven's gut tighter. The archive was not just harvesting bodies. He saw alcoves lined with translucent pods, each holding frozen fragments of civilizations. Bones, seeds, carved idols, even the preserved bodies of children with markings he recognized from Vera's memories. Catalogued. Stored. Forgotten. Draken's voice was a growl. They keep us like trophies. Riven touched the glass of one pod, staring at a preserved Monstrous warrior with markings almost identical to Vera's. His hand trembled. Not trophies, he said softly. Samples. Like a library of extinction. The others waited for his order. His throat burned. Vera whispered, "We burn this library down." The demolition charges were set carefully, each one nested into the alien conduits where power hummed like blood. The eel folk mapped patterns of resonance, ensuring explosions would cascade through the ship's systems rather than merely scar its skin. Humans rigged triggers, hands steady even as eyes darted to the pods around them. When the last charge was planted, Riven lingered at one particular pod. Inside lay a Monstrous child, fur orange gold, ears still too large for her head, eyes closed as if in sleep. His hand pressed against the glass. The memory of little Ember's smile seared his chest. "She looks like my sister," Vera whispered, voice trembling with a grief so old it still bled fresh. Riven bowed his head. "We'll give her a funeral," he murmured. "Not a specimen tag." The first explosion rippled through the ship like a thunderclap. Lights flickered, alarms wailed. The archive vessel shuddered under its own collapsing veins. Drones swarmed from alcoves, clicking and screeching, but the resistance moved as one. Draken's heavy weapon split drones apart with snarling bursts. Human sharpshooters dropped advancing constructs with precision fire. The eel folk danced along walls, cutting conduits with blades that sang. Riven became motion itself, half human, half vulpine, all fury. He tore through drones with claws he did not remember growing, his harmonized voice scattering their sensor nets. When the central conduit ruptured, the entire corridor screamed with light. Pods shattered, releasing ash and fragments that swirled into the chaos. For one heartbeat, it looked as though the dead danced in the fire. "Time to leave!" Salva barked over comms. They ran, the ship collapsing behind them. Flames licked alien walls, drones screeched in confusion, alarms rose in harmonies of panic. The vessel shook like a wounded beast. Their stolen craft detached, thrusters burning, as the archive cruiser folded in on itself in a blossom of fire. From the viewport, Riven watched it die. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw the silhouettes of Vera's people rise in the smoke, singing their star songs into the void. The resistance ship broke atmosphere, engines howling as it dove for the cover of storm-racked clouds. Archive vessels screamed past in pursuit, their scanners blind to the harmonics still masking the stolen hull. They vanished into the tempest, ghosts swallowed by rain. Inside, silence held. Fighters checked wounds, counted ammo. Some laughed with the edge of hysteria. Others wept, finally releasing what they had locked away during the mission. Riven sat apart, staring at his bloodied hands. His claws, when had they grown so long? He scraped them against the deck until sparks leapt. His throat still hummed with Vera's harmonics, his voice not wholly his own. "We struck a chord they cannot ignore," she whispered. "But each note we sing takes more of you. Do you feel it?" "Yes," he admitted. His reflection in the viewport showed amber eyes burning brighter, vulpine pupils narrowing in the stormlight. He barely recognized the man he had been on Talon Ridge. Salva approached, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You've given us more than victory," she said. "You've given us proof. They can be hurt. They can bleed." Riven nodded, but his chest was heavy. Victory had tasted of ash, not triumph. For every pod they had shattered, how many more existed across the fleet? Across other worlds? The Archive's hunger was endless, and he carried within him the memories of a people who had already been devoured. As the storm swallowed the ship, Riven closed his eyes. He could still hear the echoes of the child in the pod, sleeping forever. He swore then, silently, to Vera, to the Resistance, to himself, "I will not stop until the Archive remembers what it is to fear." When they returned to the sanctuary, the people gathered in awe. Word of the raid spread faster than wind across dunes. Refugees knelt as Riven passed, some whispering blessings, others touching the ground in reverence. Salva called a council. Leaders of every species crowded the chamber. A crystalline elder stepped forward, her body glowing faintly with internal fire. "Long ago, our singers spoke of a voice that would carry two peoples," she intoned. "A throat of two songs woven. The twice sung. We thought it metaphor. Now we see it standing before us." Riven shifted uneasily. "I'm just a soldier who refused to die." The elder shook her head slowly. "No. You are the bridge our prophecies foretold. And bridges are not built to rest. They are built to carry armies." The chamber erupted with voices, some praising, some wary, some demanding he lead them into open war. The humans argued for caution, fearing overreach. The aliens pressed for vengeance, desperate to reclaim dignity stolen with their worlds. Through it all, Vera whispered from within, "They will follow you." But will they follow Riven Hale? Or will they follow Vera Emberwind Reborn? Which are you? He had no answer. Only the fire in his throat, and the promise of wars yet to come. They found the pattern in the noise. Salva and the scholars laid archive telemetry over skylattice maps the eel folk had kept in their bones, then folded in human satellite ghosts that hadn't been deorbited yet. The picture that emerged wasn't a fleet. It was a circuit. "The sterilizers aren't just ships," the crystalline elder said, glow dim with worry. "They're end effectors. The command lives in the index, a coordinating mind braided through relay spines above the planet. Cut ships, it grows new ends. Cut relays, it goes deaf." Riven finished, throat tight. "The index sits at an anchor," Salva added, tapping a moon-shadowed icon, a thin, skeletal station parked in a Lagrange cradle, its veins like the ribs of a dead leviathan. "Null field generators. Nothing harmonic can touch it. That's where they bury the orders." Drekken's ears flattened. "So we break the unbreakable." Riven stared at the projection. He could feel Vera considering. "A single throat won't reach that far," she murmured. "Even ours." "Not a throat," he said. "A choir." They called the station the Spire of Silence. From far off, it looked like a twig, delicate enough to snap. Up close, it was all terrible restraint, mass minimized, field strengths maximized, corridors at angles designed to make warm minds stumble. Null generators pulsed like hearts that hated music. The plan split three ways. Human artillery units on the surface would wake the fleet with a feint. Monstrous and eel folk strike teams would board 3 external veins and plant amplifiers salvaged from the canyon and tuned to sing inside the narrowest cracks of the null field. Riven, Draken, and a handful of scouts would push for the core, where the index's local process nested. Before launch, Riven sat with little Ember in the orchard cave. The bioluminescent vines threw green-blue ripples across her cheeks. "Can I come?" she asked for the 5th time, already knowing the answer and bargaining with fate anyway. "You are coming," he said, and her ears shot up. He smiled. "From here. The amplifiers need a counter-melody on the ground. We're going to set the desert singing. I can't keep time up there without someone wise holding it down here." She pressed her palms together to hide the grin and failed. "I can be wise. I know," he said, and ruffled the fur between her ears like it was permission and armor both. When the strike force departed, the sanctuary hummed with wires and breath. Children stood at the mics beside elders. The eel folk tuned water harps. The crystalline singers dimmed and brightened their bodies in slow metronomes. Sava closed her eyes and found the note that meant hold. Riven's last look at the desert showed a sky beginning to pink. He carried it with him into black. Their stolen cutter made it to the spire with a shudder. The docking collar hissed. Air that hated lungs rushed in. The eel folk flowed through first, letting their swaying bodies taste currents for traps. Draken followed, a silent storm, weapon cradled. Riven led with memory as compass. Vera fed him paths. Left. Wait the floor light, it drinks on the beat. Guard ahead has a mechanical breath, count 3 and cross between. They found the first nullheart in a chamber like an inside-out speaker. Coils thrummed silence. Riven pressed an amplifier plate to a seam and keyed it live. It didn't blast sound, it unrolled permission. The nulls shivered, infinitesimally. 2 more. Draken breathed. They ghosted, set plates, moved. Drones found them twice. Both times, the eel folk opened throats and sang a sound like oil poured into gears. The drones seized, folded, went still. At the core, the index waited. It didn't look like a brain. It looked like math. Tensioned lattices and cycling light trapped in a scaffold that should have fallen but was held together by the stubbornness of its own equation. It won't hear you, Vera warned. Not yet. The spire is built to unmake song. Riven touched his throat. Felt the scar's heat. Felt 2 pulses answer. Then we don't sing at it, he said. We sing through it. He opened comms. Sava. Little Ember. Begin. The first notes rose from sand. Little Ember's voice wasn't large. It was true. She held the desert on a single pitch, and the desert decided to listen. Children took the line. Elders braided harmonies. Human choirs, once drilled on anthems, learned new intervals and held them like they mattered more than marching. Riven felt the sound coming up through stone and metal and vacuum. He turned the plates until their trace lights went from sullen to curious. The spire's null fought. It didn't know how to lose. The amplifiers didn't ask it to. They offered a different job, carry this instead. Salva's voice slid underneath, anchor and promise. The eelfolk harps poured water notes into the net. Crystalline elders brightened and dimmed, beating measures and light. Draken grunted and added a thin, raw harmony he'd learned before his first hunt. Riven, ardent, took a breath that was his and someone else's and let both out together. The index noticed. Not as fear. As input. New data flooded a framework designed to catalog and sterilize. It did what it had always done, labeled, sorted, tried to file. Riven gave it too much to hold. If you do this, Vera whispered from inside the light, we change. Permanently. He almost laughed. I thought that was the point. Not like this. There won't be a you and a me to argue. There will be a chord. And it will be us. He felt the child in the pod. He felt Talon Ridge. He felt a wind older than his species run claws through fur and hair at once. Vera, he said softly. You asked me to be a bridge. Bridges don't decide who crosses. They exist so crossings can happen. I'm done fearing what we are. Silence answered, the good kind. Then sing, ardent. He did. It wasn't pretty. Pretty is a luxury you buy with victory. The cord that poured through Riven cracked on edges his throat couldn't smooth. It tore at old scar tissue and wrote new. It howled into math. And for the first time since it had left the factory that had built its rules, the index's model did not converge. The spire shook. Null fields wavered. The amplifiers swallowed silence and shone it back as welcome. Across the fleet, sterilizers armed to make deserts of cities hiccuped in their firing loop and asked their parent process whether the definition of unclean had changed. It had. It was now anything that refuses a song. With the desert singing, the definition labeled the planet as self-organizing music. On archive decks, drones paused with mandibles mid-snap. In pods, stasis fields blipped. The index tried to roll back to a last known good state. The cord matched to that checkpoint and bled it warm. Stern systems that had only ever logged, sample acquired, process begins, wrote a new line, request, listen. Emergency protocols tripped. Overload. Lattice collapse. The spire's veins curled like leaves under frost. One broke. The station lurched in its cradle. Draken hooped, half terror, half triumph, and dragged Riven away from a shower of shards. Time to leave the library, he shouted. They ran. The Ilfolk flowed. Riven stumbled, half singing, half sobbing, body answering instruments it had not known existed an hour ago. Vera held him upright from the only place she could, inside the same note. Their cutter kicked free as the spire peeled apart. Behind them, the index's local mind went from an architecture to a weather pattern, still there, no longer a building, now a storm. The fleet above the planet staggered, not dying, not obedient. Uncertain. For a machine culture, uncertainty is the wound that bleeds forever. In the days that followed, the archive did not sue for peace. It had no word for it. It did something stranger, it stopped. Sterilizers hung quiet in blue skies while human pilots towed them into deep desert and buried them under sand like shark teeth, warded with songs that made their circuits sleepy. Drones dropped to the ground and tried to eat lichen like animals, then ran out of instructions and waited for a future that would not arrive. Some ships lit engines and left without a vector. A few went feral and had to be hunted down with the old tools, courage, patience, a community that refused to count the lost as numbers. They found pods. Thousands. The smallest were only bones. The largest held whole rooms of lives erased mid-laugh. No one argued over salvage that week. Everyone built pyres, altars, cairns. Human priests asked Monstrous elders how to sing properly. Monstrous elders asked human mothers how to say goodbye without breaking something you need later. Riven slept little. When he woke, his voice wasn't a choir anymore. It wasn't solitary either. The cord had changed him. Not a merge that devoured parts. A braid that made new rope. Salva drafted the bridge accords at a table that had been a wing spar. Humans signed with ink and thumbprint. Ilfolk pressed quoprints in wet clay. Monstrous marked with glowing claws that faded to scars in the paper. The first clause was simple: no one is a resource. The second was practical: when the archive remembers itself and returns, we answer together. Draken found Riven on a ridge the night the last sterilizer went dark. He handed him a knife. Its edge sang politely. I forged it from the spire, while your people argued whose flag to fly over a scrap pile, he said wry. For the one who taught me that stubborn isn't the same thing as alone. Riven weighed the blade. It was light and true. Will you ever stop telling me I'm an idiot when I need to be told? Never, Draken said, and showed his teeth in something that had decided to be a smile. Years made a habit of passing. The desert didn't stop being desert. It did agree to be other things too. Terraces stepped down from the sanctuary, water whispering through channels that had learned to be patient. Children ran the steps and pretended to be ships. Sometimes the archive's old hulls sang back, rust making music where wind caught it. Little Ember grew into her name. She learned to drop a stone into a still pool and have it land on the beach she chose. She learned which seeds like which songs. She learned that grief is not a thing you finish, it is a thing you carry more gracefully. Riven, ardent, to anyone who had met him after the spire, kept moving. He taught militias how to hear wind warnings. He taught councils how to argue toward a future with room in it. He took the knife Draken had made and used it exactly 4 times in anger, and 1,000 times to cut bread. On a hot evening he walked alone to the same ruin where a dying soldier had chosen to be more than one person. The wall still remembered his back. The sand still knew his knees. The sky had not changed and was entirely new. He took from his pocket a thin ring of metal, a link from Vera's broken chain, worried smooth by years of thumbs. He set it in a crack in the stone and pressed it there until it felt right. Vera Emberwind of the Monstrous, he said, speaking the name like a toast and a truth. I carried you. You carried me. We made something we didn't have language for, and we decided to live inside it anyway. If there's a higher where names go, know this, your people sing here still. The wind picked up. It came off the dunes like steps. For a breath, the rustle through scrub sounded like laughter. He turned back toward the sanctuary lights. Behind him, two shadows stretched long. On the ground, they overlapped and parted and then overlapped again, like a rhythm practiced until it became a walk. Some nights, when patrols camp under a sky that isn't trying to kill them on purpose, they tell the story of the twice sung. Sometimes the hero is a human who learned to sing until machines forgot how to burn. Sometimes she's a foxwoman who braided a dead world into a living throat. Sometimes it's a chorus with no center that holds anyway. All the versions end the same way, with the reminder that bridges are only miraculous until you've walked them enough times that they become part of home, and that the point of a bridge is never the bridge. It's everything it lets you reach. Rivenhale did not die alone. Ardent did not live alone. The archive, whatever remembered itself under that name, did not forget the sound of a planet that answered together. And the desert, which had once felt like broken glass, learned to sound like water.